Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just click the link in the show description to support now.
The following podcast is a Vasilis Skarlias production.
Hello everyone, I'm Kennedy.
And I'm Vasilis.
We run Changemaker Z, a student-run initiative that aims to empower, educate, and connect Gen Zers interested in entrepreneurship.
We interview teenagers with impactful projects and create resources to help you change the world. If they can do it, so can you.
On this podcast, we discuss the logistics of creating different types of projects with Gen Zers who have already done it. We will leave our social media and website information in the description. Welcome everyone. I'm pretty sure that all these past days you have listened somewhere to the COP26 initials, corresponding to one of the biggest environmental events for 2021. Today we are here with Guylaine Fondel and JP Ariano to comment and talk about some of the most important subjects of the United Nations Climate Change Conference that took place in Glasgow between October 31st through November 12th. Before we start, we have some exciting news to share with you today. The Changemaker Z app is now released on the App Store, in which you can find every section of the podcast and many more exciting features. It will be available on the Play Store soon. Now, let's introduce this episode's guest. We'll be speaking with Guylaine Fondel.
Hi everyone, I'm Guylaine. I'm a science communication lead and content director at Climate Science.
And hi folks, my name's JP. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm also a content director at Climate Science. And we've been keeping up to date with a lot of the stuff that's been going on at COP recently.
Yes, they are two climate activists and science communication leads at Climate Science, an educational charity with a focus on climate solutions. We're so happy to have you guys here today. We're excited to talk about COP.
Kennedy, I love your enthusiasm. Thank you very much, both Guylaine and JP, for being here. So in our first meeting, we had mentioned some guidelines that we want to cover on this episode. And through this episode, we will go through the climate finance, the transportation, and the energy transmission subjects that were also introduced on the COP26. And tell us, we had discussed about climate finance, but what exactly is it?
So when we talk about climate finance, essentially we're talking about the funding that goes towards mitigating and adapting to climate change. So when I mention the public and private sector, it's because we need funding from both the public sector, which would mean governments, for example, and the private sector, which would mean corporations and companies. So over the last 12 years, we were expected to see $100 billion per year from the public sector going towards helping countries who cannot afford to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and also shouldn't be bearing the burden of doing so. And high-income countries essentially failed to provide the necessary funding. And so at COP26, this was such a big conversation because they had to reassess the funding that they were going to provide towards these low and middle-income countries. And set out new goals for the future.
And we want to clarify for the audience that when we're talking about mitigation, that essentially means reducing emissions, right? So that means doing anything we can to actively reduce emissions. So that means installing solar panels. That means replanting forests. That means decarbonizing industries like steel, automobiles, etc. And when we talk about adaptation, we talk about being ready and prepared for the eventual effects that will come across from climate change. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of them, right? The floods in BC and India, the famine in Madagascar, etc. Those are things that are happening now and are only going to get worse. So we have to be able to adapt to those challenges. And the reason that we put a lot of focus on high-income countries is that if you look at historic emissions, for example, of all of the emissions that have ever been emitted by the human race, 25% of them have come from the United States alone. For example, And we know, I think everybody listening here knows that 330 million people, the population of the United States, is not 25% of the population, right? Not even close. And you see similar figures for countries in Europe, places like Australia, Canada, etc., that have emitted significantly more per capita in historical terms than a lot of low-income and developing and low and middle-income nations. And that is why a lot of the burden should be placed on these high-income nations that are the main causers of these effects, but are not feeling most of the effects themselves. Aside from maybe like Australia and southern US, most of Europe will be fairly okay. Obviously, nowhere is going to be okay, but they're not going to face the worst impacts that we're going to see in, for example, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, places where they haven't emitted a lot and they're going to face the worst consequences. So you do hear a lot of the blame being, not blame, but a lot of the responsibility being put on high-income nations. That is why. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just a matter of where they're located and whether they're going to be affected, but it's, so for example, when we talk about the adaptive capacity of a country, it's how well they can adapt to climate change, right? So it's not just, how the exposure is measured as a result of their ability to pay for adaptation measures. Cities, for example, that are located on coastlines in high-income countries are less likely to be exposed than cities that are located on coastlines in low and middle-income countries, right? So that's where all the, having to pay for these things comes in. And part of that is the inequality side of it, and that, they don't deserve to have to pay for these repercussions of the actions of high-income countries. But on top of that, a lot of these countries are in debt, and a lot of these countries just flat out cannot pay for this, and it would take such a blow to their economies to have to do so. So it's a really, really, really critical part of talking about climate change is how to pay for it.
And the most important fact is that these rich countries got rich because they emitted so much, because they took labor, they took energy, they took capital, they took land and resources from these low-income and middle-income countries, right? Essentially leaving them with dirt, with almost nothing. So that exactly now they just can't afford it. They just don't have the resources nor the capital to be able to mitigate and adapt in necessary ways.
May I ask which is the position of China in this whole situation?
Yeah, so in terms of climate finance, I'm not entirely well versed on how much funding China is giving. But it's an interesting situation because within China, the disparity between the lower class and the higher class is enormous. So it's important to look at both the funding within the country and outside of it. Right now, China is the first most polluting country in the world. Historically, it is not. But even without those historical emissions, it still carries some sort of the responsibility towards providing funding towards climate finance.
Right, and at the same time, so sorry, did I get that right? You mentioned that yes, they're leading in solar panels, but because of so much smog and pollution, they're not as efficient. Sorry, did I catch that right? Or right? That's actually extremely interesting. I actually hadn't heard about that before. Because it can get quite complicated, right? When a lot of people see countries like China and India and being like, well, they have billions of people, right? They're emitting so much, right? When you look at a per capita basis, it's not the case, right? It's nowhere near the case to the cases that to the people in, for example, North America or Europe. And when you look at the expansion of, renewable energy and things like that, they're actually expanding at a much faster rate than they are, obviously because they need a lot more power than some of the nations that we've talked about before in Europe or North America. However, nobody's going away scot-free. It's everybody's fault, right? We're not pointing fingers, and we don't want to blame anybody. We just want to highlight the inequality and the climate justice of it all to adequately proportion responsibility. But China still has a role to play. The fact that they don't want to shut down their stop funding coal power plants within their nation is problematic. It's extremely problematic. And if we don't manage to convince China to stop doing that before 2030, we may not very well have a shot at 1.5, to be totally frank, because China produces so much of their energy with coal. But at the same time, you also have to put yourself in the shoes of Chinese politicians, for example, right? Like, what do they want? Well, they want their people to prosper. They want their people to afford, to live the lives that the Europeans are living, that the North Americans are living, right? They just want the best for their people. And how do they do that as cheap and efficiently as possible, right? Well, it's with coal, it's with, dirty fossil gas, etc. I'm not justifying what they're doing, right? But when you put yourself in their shoes, right? Obviously, it makes sense for everybody to be doing what they are. What they don't think about is the longer term picture, right? It's like, okay, well, this is good for my citizens now, but it might not be good for them 20, 30, 50, 70 years down the line, right? We might be, and it's very hard for human minds to kind of focus on such long-term things because we don't tend to be around for very long. And it's like, oh yeah, it'll be their problem, it won't be mine, is a lot of the mentality that we see. But no, you're totally right. There needs to be more political will from everybody, including China, most definitely China. Because, if, for example, if you get the EU, US, and China to be in a pact of like a carbon market or legally binding carbon reductions, then almost everybody will have to follow suit because they make almost everything,
Basically, like, gone are the days where you can just sit back and be like, oh, this is not in my future. I don't have to worry about this. You said 2030? I'll be what, like 25 or something like that? And like, also, I heard you mentioning the 1.5. When I was researching COP, well, first of all, can we just like kind of clarify what COP26 is?
Yeah.
And also like what's so important about the 1.5?
Yeah. So COP26 is the Conference of Parties, and so this is something that happens once a year. This is really just the place for all of the world leaders, but leaders within the public and both the private sector, for activists to come together and to decide on what future pledges are going to look like, and kind of map out the course for 1.5. Mm-hmm. And the reason we stick to 1.5 and the 1.5 number is a kind of a contentious number, just because we fight for 1.5 because even 0.5 of a degree more means increased loss of biodiversity, means even more extreme weather events, means greater inequality even, and so we want to try to limit this as much as possible. And the reason I say that it's contentious is because 1.5 is really hard to meet at this point. And with current pledges, we are not set out to reach 1.5. And that was kind of the conclusion that a lot of us came out of COP26 with is, was this worth it? Was this a failure of a COP because we're not meeting 1.5 with these current pledges? But sticking to a 1.5 goal is incredibly important because, like we said earlier, it's low and middle income countries that are going to be affected the most. So it's very easy for a high income country to say, well, why don't we just try for 2 degrees Celsius? Because they have the funding and the means to be able to adapt to a world of 2 degrees. And it's a very short-sighted view to say that we should be limiting warming to 2 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees, in my opinion.
And just for a little bit more context, folks, we measure this 1.5 compared to a baseline of pre-industrial emissions. So that's about 1750s to 1850s. We have recorded data of what the average temperature around the world was like then, and we can clearly see that it's been slowly and now increasingly rising throughout the world. So when we're talking about 1.5, we're not talking about, look, outside today, it's maybe -3 degrees here in Montreal. Tomorrow, it might be -5, right? We're not talking about that kind of day-to-day difference. We're talking about a global average difference. So scientists all around the world, in Ghana, in China, in Russia, in the US, in Chile, etc., they're all taking constant measurement data, trying to average out the temperature of the world. Right now, the average temperature is about 14 degrees Celsius. which is about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than it was in pre-industrial times. And right now it's dangerous, right? We're at 1.1 degrees, and that is already dangerous. We're already seeing famines and natural disasters on a scale that we haven't seen before. 1.5 is unimaginably dangerous. It's a big difference because these differences aren't linear. And, when we compare 1.5 to 2 degrees, for example, that is half a degree. Human beings can't even perceive, I don't even know how I would perceive that difference, from the temperature outside. But the difference is so vast. I'll throw some quick facts at you folks. In a 1.5 degree world, about 13.8% of the population will be exposed to severe heat waves at least once every 5 years. The type that we saw in British Columbia, for example, this summer. If we get to 2 degrees Celsius, this fraction of the population is 3 times larger. That's almost 40% of the global population. That's close to 2 billion people, right? And it's not just people, though. In a 1.5 degree world, we're going to lose about 70% of the coral reefs in the world, without a doubt. There's no question about it. That is a fact. In a 2 degree world, 99% of coral reefs are gone. All of them. All coral reefs in the world would be essentially gone. You couldn't go scuba diving and seeing coral reefs because they just won't exist in a 2 degree world. It's just not feasible for them to do that. And when we talk about rising sea levels, sometimes we don't even know because of the complexity of the climate system and how ocean currents move and air currents as well. We just don't actually know what the feedback loops will look like at such high degrees of temperature. So we might be totally off in the sense that it might be much, much worse than it is. But I want to take a step back and mention to folks that, look, this is a lot of doom and gloom talk, and I'm really not for that kind of gloom and doom talk. And I want to let you folks know that today, if we wanted to, if all politicians agreed, if all business leaders agreed, etc., we could not easily, but we could quickly decarbonize our entire industry, particularly in the global north and eventually in the global south. We have the technology available today. It's possible. We can fix climate change, and we are slowly fixing climate change. But what is missing is political will and financial incentives, which is unfortunate. But I want you folks to know it is not doom and gloom. There is hope. There is people working on this around the clock. Ghislaine and I are working on this around the clock, trying to educate folks, to raise awareness so that people vote for the people who prioritize the climate, or that people, it's called voting with your wallet, right? You buy things that are more sustainable, that are more resilient, or will last longer, etc. So there's hope. Things will be gloomy if we don't act, but there's still time and there's still opportunities to fix things.
This reminds to me, there is a documentary called Before the Flood, and it presents DiCaprio, who is, if I'm not mistaken, president of the committee for the nature in the UN. I don't remember exactly. Never mind. And there is an interview with an astronaut in NASA, and they are discussing about that if we stop right now burning fossil fuels, then the whole globe will start becoming more cold and becoming in the natural and normal levels. And this will bring us to the next subject, there are some other ways, because it's too difficult to put all this effort to change all these political views and ventures from one day to another. And there is this what we called the transportation in public sector to become even more decarbonized, to electrifying the public transportation cars.
Yeah. So when it comes to the transportation sector, and this is something that I was genuinely disappointed in with COP26, was the amount of focus on electrifying vehicle fleets and electrifying the transport sector generally, rather than putting more focus on public transportation, for example. Which would seem like a very common sense thing to go to, is that, to reduce the amount of cars on the road, why don't you put people in the same car? Would you be with us? And that still comes with having to electrify vehicle fleets, and that we can electrify public transportation itself. But a lot of COP26, in fact, most of the conversation around transportation was on electrifying cars that people would buy. And as a result, a lot of leaders in the automobile industry were invited to have those conversations, and things like that can lead to special interests becoming involved in the decisions that are made for the planet and that are affecting people all over the world. So when we talk about solutions to transportation, it's really, really, really important to note that there's not just one solution. It is not just to go to electric cars entirely. Yes, we need to move away from petrol-powered vehicles, but we also need to be putting funding towards public transportation as well. And so that comes with the lowest carbon modes of transportation, which are walking and cycling. And cities right now are built for cars, around cars entirely. And city planning is entirely focused on building these roads, on kind of spreading out cities. In the US, for example, I grew up in Miami. Miami is, going to be decimated by climate change in the future. And this is a city that is entirely spread out. There's relatively no public transportation. You can't walk anywhere.
There is no hope.
You can't cycle anywhere. And that's just one example. It's all over the world. It's something that I think the automobile industry has had a lot of say in, is how we plan out our cities and ensuring that people need cars to get from place to place, which affects people of different classes differently, because now people have to pay for their cars to get into their job, for example, and it leads to increased emissions. So by allowing them into the conversation about what we do about the transportation sector, of course, we're going to come out with a solution being, let's just electrify everything, and now we'll just sell electric vehicles rather than focusing on public transport and meeting the actual needs of citizens who may very well prefer to be cycling to work or to be walking.
And to add on to that, if folks think that you can't get around with a bike, you're like, oh, I've got kids, oh, I got to go do groceries, oh, etc. Google a cargo bike. These things are awesome. They're like sturdy. They can even be electric. They've got a solid frame, and you can put a whole huge basket. You can have 2-3 kids riding on it at the same time. I've seen a lot of people riding them here in Montreal. And even in the winter, like I ride my bike in minus 25 degree weather, it sucks, but it's possible, right? And if only their bus system were a lot better, I'd probably be using it more. No, but what Guylaine is saying is a big point. There's too much focus on individual electric vehicles, and that's allowing vested interests like Tesla, Ford, etc., Volkswagen to play too much of a large role in the conversation. Saying, yeah, guys, let's subsidize all these electric cars. Let's make sure everybody has got their own electric vehicle. Whereas, I think everybody here agrees that cars suck. Like, I hate having to wait to cross a road and all so much space is devoted just so cars can drive around. And, there's where it could be like green corridors, parks, open spaces, spaces for the arts, etc. But no, it's all for these damn cars. If we could really put a lot more focus on electrifying public transport and on getting people to very, very low carbon use vehicles like cargo bikes and even just making things easy to access. For example, like the mayor of Paris, Miss Hidalgo, one of her commitments is to make Paris a 15-minute walkable city, that you can get to anything that you may need, a hospital, a park, store, whatever, in 15 minutes. Anywhere that you live in the city, right? So that you don't need a car. There's no point in having a car because you could get everywhere you need within 15 minutes of walking. Yeah, but those are our thoughts on transport. A lot of people have very different ideas and opinions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are many, many different perspectives through this subject. The idea and the point that I'm keeping is that when we are like when we talk about electrifying the cars fleet, and actually we promote even more the users to consume, like to change their cars and change to electric car, and then again in order to produce all of these cars, then we will waste much more energy. And this comes to the next subject, the energy transmission, like in the agricultural sector, all the electricity for our cities, and which are the committed countries that they can they have a way and they can control this energy transmission sector.
Yeah. So one of the big things with energy is that a couple of these sectors um, are very hard to decarbonize. Well, some of them are less using an energy, more on chemical processes. Sorry, I guess I'm going on a tangent. Let me repeat that. If you can cut this out later, that would be great.
Yes.
So energy is probably the most difficult subject when it comes to climate, right? 76% of emissions come from energy, whether they're used in agriculture, used in our cars, used to heat our homes, etc. One of the biggest uses is our buildings, our commercial residential buildings that probably have pretty poor insulation, have pretty poor, not efficient heating or cooling, etc. That is just guzzling away energy. One of the other aspects that makes this topic really hard is that a lot of countries have a lot of fossil fuels and have a lot of vested interests in making sure that people keep using these fossil fuels, right? If you talk to somebody in Saudi Arabia or Russia, they'd have a much different idea than someone in Uruguay, where Uruguay has absolutely no fossil fuels, and they're like, yeah, we got to get rid of them at all, like completely, quickly. But for example, places like the UAE, their citizens enjoy a tax-free country, right? Because a lot of the government revenue doesn't need to come from people's incomes. It comes from the oil industry, right? It's nationalized and they sell it. So we've essentially, I mean, a lot of scientists have come to realize that COPs and these kind of treaties to phase out coal and to make out these carbon markets, etc. Just really aren't going to cut it. They're not going to decrease the amount of fossil fuel use as quickly as we need, particularly because none of these things are really legally binding, and there's very few countries that are willing and committed to totally phase out fossil fuels. For example, the United States, was a big champion at COP and was like, yeah, we got to decarbonize as fast as possible. Biden is like, I'm not Trump, I believe in this and this is so important and etc. And then literally a couple of days after COP finished, the Biden administration leased out the biggest ever plot of land in the Mexican Gulf for gas and oil drilling, literally days after COP. So it's not going to work. I'm sure Biden has good intentions. I'm sure he wants to help the environment, but there are fossil fuel interests embedded in all of our politics. So something that I've seen come up a lot is a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Now, if that rings a bell, it's because you've probably heard of a nuclear weapons non-proliferation treaty, which happened during the peak of the Cold War, where the United States and Russia were trying to essentially decrease the amount of nuclear weapons in the world. So they wanted to phase out completely the amount of nuclear weapons that there could be. And this was a legally binding kind of agreement. So many countries are pushing for nations, not countries, many scientists and organizations and prominent activists are pushing for countries to join a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, where essentially they want to do everything possible to make it legally binding that countries have to transition away from carbon-intensive fuels, right? That's not completely possible for all nations, right? It really depends on how much hydropower you can have, how much nuclear power you have available right now, etc. Because I'm sure you folks know that wind and solar are very variable and aren't able to cover the entire grid due to the sun not shining at night and the wind's not always being blowing. So you do need some sort of nuclear or hydro or fossil gas to kind of offset that. Unless somebody solves fusion, dear listeners, please solve fusion. that's one big way that folks are trying to limit the use of fossil fuels. And this is just me speculating, but I really would not be surprised if at some point in the future we start seeing individual citizens taking action, taking matters into their hands, right? Like flying drones into fossil fuel infrastructure or taking down power lines and stuff like that. I'm not advocating for anything like that. Please, for the record, I don't condone violence. But it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if people are affected in this way, and start trying to literally just destroy fossil fuel infrastructure. And the last other big one that I totally, truly support is the nationalization of the energy industry. Just like we nationalized essential services. I mean, it depends on the country, but stuff like education, healthcare, water, shelter, a lot of that stuff is nationalized, right? The government controls it because they're basic needs, right? They're basic necessities. They're stuff that citizens need. If we were to nationalize the fossil fuel industries, the fossil fuel companies, make them be owned by the government, then there would be no more vested interest, right? It would be like, okay, we own them. Let's try and get them to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. We can set quotas. We can stop their disinformation campaigns. We can stop their horrendous and extremely dangerous greenwashing. And try to really grab a hold on the situation. But again, these are all very, very. I mean, some people call them radical, some people call them not radical enough. But they're far out ideas, and I don't see many of them happening anytime soon. But it's some of the only ways that I truly see us decarbonizing our energy industry quickly enough.
Yeah, kind of put that in the context of COP26. A lot of the focus was on coal specifically and phasing out coal entirely. And a lot of countries, committed to this, but, like JP said, a lot of countries backtrack after, just talking about about phasing out coal. And for example, you had the United States who didn't pull out of a pledge like that, but, acted almost against it. Poland pulled out just a few days later. And so when we talk about the energy transition, like JP mentioned, it's also, we have to consider the energy mix for different countries. This is something that's going to be different for every nation, especially in the fact that a lot of countries cannot transition as quickly as others. So for example, low and middle income countries right now are focused more on using fossil fuels for the sake of development. And that's a major topic in development in that, all these high-income countries got to where they are today through the use of fossil fuels. And so why shouldn't low and middle-income countries have the same opportunity, to develop through the use of fossil fuels? However, these high-income countries using fossil fuels to develop led to climate change. So obviously we can't have other countries going down the same path. And that's something that's also really critical to the energy transition, is that we ensure that this is something affordable for these countries, to ensure that instead of using fossil fuels heavily to gain electricity in their countries, that they have access to renewable energy and that they have the funding to transition themselves to renewable energy and rely on that, rather than going down the same path that the high-income countries did before.
Thank you so much. I know that this whole conversation has brought awareness to people like me who didn't really know much about COP, and particularly COP26, and how we can empower youth activism and go against the huge malinformation that exists around the subject.
This was an amazing conversation, and we hope that it helped everyone that is listening right now to understand a little bit better the importance of COP26, as well as to understand what we mean when we talk about climate finance, energy transition, green transportation techniques, and so on. And of course, if you have any questions, you can ask them on the unique online community that we created for this specific episode. You can find the link in the description. But for now, I would like to say a huge thanks to Ghislaine and JP for being part of this amazing conversation.
Yeah, of course. No, it was really a pleasure to talk about this, and I hope that something to take away for those listening is that it's very important to be critical of the decisions that are being made by our world leaders that are on behalf of the climate, of the natural world, of people everywhere. And that we do have the solutions and we are ready to solve climate change. And it is so important that we have the involvement of everyone who is willing to really call on their leaders and on companies and your friends and your family to do as much as they can to really commit to solving the climate crisis.
Yeah, really. Thank you folks for having us here. It's been a pleasure. We're always willing to share our 2 cents and get people involved. Like Ghislaine said, be aware, raise your awareness, educate yourself, learn about this topic and educate those around you. That is one of the best things that you can do for climate change. Aside from, like I said, vote for the right people. Right now, a lot of issues matter, sure, but the issue that matters the most and should be at the top of your agenda is climate. If your preferred politician isn't putting climate at the top of their agenda, you should probably be rethinking your choices. But thanks again for having us, folks. We really appreciated your time. And until next time, folks, don't forget to change the world.
Thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We had such a great time. Make sure to leave us a review. If you want more Changemakers content, you can follow us on Instagram at Gen Zers to Rise and on Facebook at ChangemakersZ.